So I recently moved to a big city about 1,000 miles away from my hometown of very few people. Not knowing the area very well, I secured an apartment directly in the worst part of town. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and I'm pretty small, and I've always been weary of people because of a meth problem of where I grew up at. In this new area, there were gunshots about twice a week, every week, meth heads and homeless people wandering around, and all kinds of creeps lurking by the dumpster at night. The police were constantly at my complex for this or that, and would even ask us if it was absolutely necessary to come out when we called about stuff happening. I was on high alert 24/7, and always carried a knife and mace in case shit went down. One bad thing did happen to me while I lived there, and it was nothing that I could have ever dreamed I would experience. So it's 1 a.m., and I was home by myself indulging in some mindless Netflix movies when I hear the most erratic knock on my door. I expect it's the police coming to question me about some more shootings or gang violence like usual. No. I look through the peephole, and there is this crazy-looking, possibly methed-out lady standing there, looking terrified. So fearing that she may either be hurt and need help or try to hurt me, I grab my mace, stashed it in my pocket, and I open the door to where I'm just barely peeking out. This is when I notice she's wearing a fucking hospital gown covered in blood. Just like a real-life horror movie, standing at my step with her crazy eyes, blood everywhere. She mumbles a bit and then asks me for water. So I say, "Sure, I'll be right back," and I lock the door behind me. I'm trying my hardest to stay rational and not freak the fuck out. I have some pretty substantial anxiety issues, so I was well on my way to a panic attack. So at this point, I think she might be really hurt, so I grab a bottle of water and decide to go out and wait with her with my concealed weapons until I can get the police there. I figure if she's really hurt, I can at least make sure she gets medical attention. Well, she obviously noped the fuck out of there, because when I opened the door to look for her, I didn't see her anywhere. What I saw instead was much, much worse. On my front step, where she had been, was a pile of bloody bandages, along with her bloody hospital gown. And on top of all that, there was a bloody fetus. I shit you not, a bloody, dead fetus. I will never be able to get that image out of my head. I've never been so terrified. I thought I was in the goddamn Twilight Zone, or some fucked up Stephen King movie. I called 911 and explained what happened. They knew it was necessary this time, and they were there in 3 minutes flat. They took pictures and cleaned up the step, and had 6 cop cars lining the parking lot, as well as the emergency responders. They filled me in, and apparently this woman was a drug addict, and her drug addict boyfriend tried to beat the pregnancy out of her. She was in the hospital, but I guess she escaped and wandered deliriously around the city and ended up on my doorstep. They had been looking for her after the emergency room called with a code yellow. I honestly felt so bad for her. She was probably harmless and didn't deserve what happened to her. I have no idea what happened to her after that, and I got the fuck out of that place the second my lease was up.
I work in a fairly busy hospital downtown, in the NICU. I usually work at night, and I kid you not, this happened to me less than 5 minutes ago. I figured it would be good to get this down in writing before I forgot. It's also a way for me to have some sort of proof in case something comes of it. During orientation, we are taught to be observant to the signs of a possible abductor. We were taught to look for oversized clothing, bags, and shifty behavior. Luckily, I've never encountered a strange individual until just now. It's currently 2:59 a.m., and I've been sitting at the front desk since 11. I'm a nursing student, so I usually just do clerical work around the unit. I also watch the cameras to make sure no one is here that isn't supposed to be here. It's usually pretty quiet at night. However, I've already had a sort of weird night, so this just adds a cherry on top of it. The NICU and most of the second floor is a locked unit. That means that in order to gain entrance, you have to pick up a phone which then rings to the desk. Usually it's parents wanting in to see their babies and family members who are lost. It quiets down around 11, so no one usually comes in or out during my shift, with the exception of housekeeping. One of the security cameras is situated so I can see who is picking up the first phone. I had been sitting here browsing Reddit when the phone rang. I glanced over at the phone, thinking it was a parent wanting an update or something like that. It took me a second to register that it was the number for the first set of doors/phone. I picked it up and looked over to the screen. There was a lady in baggy clothing with a sling on her arm. I answered the door, and she said she wanted in to find her cousin, who apparently had been brought up from the emergency department. I asked for the last name, and she unintelligibly rambled off a Latino name that I only caught the first part of. Knowing that we did not have any new admissions, I told her we didn't have anyone by that name. I tried to get some information out of her, and she again said that her cousin had been brought up from the ED. I told her in that case she would want to go to labor and delivery and talk to them. She hesitated, then said okay and walked away. I got a really weird feeling from her, so I checked the census to see if there was anyone that was being assessed in L&D, and there wasn't. So either she was at the wrong hospital, or she wanted in the unit to do something a little bit more sinister than just to see her cousin. I shrugged it off and figured that her cousin was in L&D and that she would find her and all would be well. About 5 minutes later, the same lady appeared in her extremely baggy clothing and her sling. The only difference was that this time, she was putting the sling on and using her injured hand to mess with something in her oversized sweatshirt. She picked up the phone and once again asked to be let in to find her cousin, and that L&D said that they had no one by that name. I told her the exact same thing, and that she would need to get in contact with her cousin and go back to L&D. She got hostile for a second, and then hung up the phone. Whether or not she was trying to gain access to the unit for things she shouldn't be doing, I'll never know. But creepy lady who looked like a baby snatcher, let's not ever meet again.
Despite a few creepy instances as a child, there has only been one time in my adult life that I have truly felt primal fear. My apology if it's a little long, but trust I am being as concise as possible and need to explain the surroundings a little at first. I live in a village in the middle of the English countryside. To paint an accurate picture of its size, it has a population of 4,000, but feels more like 1,000 due to its spread out nature and being surrounded on all sides by lots of fields, farms and woods that eventually connect into a pretty famous forest. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and because of this has notoriously bad phone and internet connections. Having lived here all my life, I knew the place like the back of my hand. I know where all the public footpaths through the woods are, where they connect, which are shortcuts, where to cross deep streams, etc. I have gone on walks in this area throughout my childhood with my parents and alone as an adult. Nothing bad had happened. I felt safe here. This story takes place last summer in July after I moved back home from university, had yet to get a job and smoked a lot of weed, a habit my parents despised and which I tried to keep hidden from them by going for evening walks. Multiple pre-rolled joints hidden away in my hoodie pocket. As usual, on this day they both got home at 5 p.m. We had dinner but chatted for a while longer than usual as my mom had quite a hectic day and was telling me about it. Because of this, I ended up heading out for my walk an hour later than routine, around 7 p.m. But as it was summer, the sun was still shining, so honestly, I didn't really notice that it would start getting dark while I was still out. The woodland closest to my house is less than 5 minutes away, and you enter through a gate into a farmer's field. You can see across the open area quite far until the first set of small woods obscures your view. That's where I was heading, as I knew this track takes under 2 hours and leads back into the same path I was standing on now. More than enough time to smoke 3 joints in my pocket and for the smell to leave my clothing, I had thought. This entire area is very popular for dog walkers, so it's not unusual to see other people while you are about, and as this is a village, everybody says hello to everybody. I lit my first joint and started walking. I'm just in my own world for a while until I was less than 100 feet before the entrance to the woods. An elderly man was coming out of them throwing a ball for his collie dog. I finished my joint and stubbed it out. As I got closer, I recognized it was John, who lived on the road next to mine and knew my grandpa. We stopped and said hello as I pet his dog, Max. While talking, I see another man coming out of the woods. No dog, bright green jacket, very tall, and had a good 10 years on me age-wise. Me and John chat another minute and say goodbye. He warns me not to stay out here too long, as it will start getting dark soon. True, the sky was bright pink and orange. The sun was indeed beginning to set. I hadn't really noticed. I continued on down the path towards the man. When we were nearly passing each other, I look up to make brief eye contact, smile, and say hello, like everyone here does, even if you don't recognize the person. My eyes intently met his. He was already looking at me. His dark eyes locked on mine. He wasn't smiling. I didn't know him at all, but I knew something was wrong. It was in his eyes. I swallowed my politeness and looked at the ground as we passed. I had lived in my university city the past couple of years, so I knew a red flag when I saw one, and my country bumpkin's manners evaporated. I quickened my pace a little, and before entering the woods, I slightly looked back. The guy was still walking in the same direction, following John. I felt relieved, laughed, cursed the weed for making me paranoid while lighting up another joint and started walking into the woods. It takes about 30 minutes to follow the path through the woods to the end. The pathway exit opened into another field that led to another set of woods. The sky was now violet, the dimming light having been obscured to me by the trees. I was already smoking my last joint and was near the entrance to the second set of woods when I felt it. Fear. Complete, crippling, absolute fear worked its way like electricity through every layer of flesh. I'd never felt anything like it before or since, but I knew what it was. I whipped around. Standing at the exit of the first set of woods was the man. I could still make out his green jacket in the fading light. He fucking doubled back, and very quickly too. I had looked back several times at those trees and he hadn't been there. For a second I froze, as did he. He knew I'd seen him. To sprint the distance between us would take him about 5 minutes. He was obviously in good shape. I threw the joint and fucking bolted into the woods, the only way I could go. I didn't dare look behind me. I sprinted for a couple of minutes before taking a sharp left turn off the path into the trees, hoping to throw him off a bit, but I couldn't see a fucking thing. The light was already darkening and the trees made it 100 times worse, especially as I was now in the thick of them, their branches catching on my clothes like fingers, whipping and scratching my bare legs so bad I bled. I ran and ran, my lungs protesting in pain, hating me for smoking so much, while my heart was throwing itself against my rib cage trying to escape. I couldn't anymore. I threw myself on the ground and behind a particularly thick trunk, my back against it, knees to my chest, hand thrown over my mouth to stifle my labored breathing, desperately trying to pump air into my lungs for the next sprint. I listened for the first time. A few seconds pass slightly, then I hear him. Heavy footfall snapping twigs behind me and about 20 feet to my left. I dare not look in case he sees me. I have my phone, but I know I have little chance of a signal being where I was, and knew he'd either hear me talking or see the light from the display. I'm not ashamed to say at this point I started to cry, the tears falling slightly down my cheeks. What the fuck? I hear a deep voice exclaim. Where are you? I know you were here. I saw you. I have to clasp both hands across my mouth to stop my scream escaping. I could hear him moving around. I panic and find enough courage to slowly peek from behind the tree. He was about 10 feet behind me, less than 20 feet to the left, with his back to me. I moved back and my eyes search the area around me. I pick up a pretty heavy rock. I carefully check on him again. His back is still turned, but he's searching the trees, hunched down lower to the ground now. I make a snap decision, and with everything I had left, I threw the rock behind me and to the right. It clattered through the branches of trees and made one hell of a noise. I watched him immediately bolt in its direction, laughing. He fucking laughed. I paused a little, hearing his footsteps get quieter until I thought I wouldn't be so visible to him if I moved and threw myself forward. I ran, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but I was also aware that I was getting further and further away from home. I knew there had to be a stream somewhere close. If I found the stream, I could follow it as it borders the land and ran parallel to some of the footpaths. I ran and ran until the trees finally cleared and I could just make out another field through them on the other side. I thank God and push myself a little bit further till I'm out of the trees, and the ground disappears from below my feet and I go head over shoulders down the stream embankment. I crash into the water below, my open mouth and lungs filling with muddy water. As I spit it out, I feel both relieved to have found the stream and terrified he's heard me. My phone is now ruined. I slowly make my way downstream as quiet as possible, listening out for him the whole time as the stream borders the woods, looking up periodically just in case. After a while, maybe a half an hour, I notice the trees begin to thin out and realize this is the edge of the woods where I would have been exiting and where the pathway connected to the original one I'd started on. If I ran, I could get home in less than 20 minutes. As quiet as I could, I dragged myself on my stomach back up the embankment army style, wanting to stay as low as possible. I peeked over the top. I could just make out the opening of the wood's exit path about 50 feet away. I sat and scanned the forest line for a couple of minutes, my eyes trying to make out movement despite it now being pitch black. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything either. I pushed myself up and sprinted as fast as I could across the field into the pathway. I knew the gate I'd entered through was in the adjoining field. It really wasn't far. I was so happy. "You fucking bitch!" came a screech from across the field. I swear my legs nearly gave out then and there. He had been waiting for me. I turned my head and saw him sprinting out of the woods at full speed. I screamed and pushed myself further, tears coating my face. All I could do was run. I crossed into the main field now and I could see the moonlight shining off the metal gate. My house was just 5 minutes away after that. I have never focused on anything as much as that gate. He was faster than me and getting closer, screaming at me the whole time about how he was going to slit my throat. I ran and ran, pushing myself up and over the gate and ran up the road. I dared look as I made the turning for my road. He was still fucking following me. I raced up my driveway and threw myself through the door, running into the living room, crying and screaming hysterically, pointing behind me towards the door. My dad ran outside while my mom grabbed a hold of me as I collapsed, shaking. As it turns out, my parents had already called the police. As I said, I was going out for an hour or so at 7 and it was now past 12 a.m. and I hadn't answered when they called my now broke phone. Very unlike me. We called the police again to explain. They came and gave a full statement. Both my parents and the police were horrified. Nothing like this happens here. There hasn't been a reported rape or murder in the last 100 years. But one look at me and it was obvious I was telling the truth. I was covered head to toe in cuts and bruises, soaking wet and covered in mud and blood. I won't go into how this experience changed me. It's depressing, but I will say the thing that scares me the most is that they never even had a suspect. Despite him following me so closely, he was gone by the time my dad ran outside. That guy is still out there, and who knows what he's really capable of.
St. Patrick's Day is a crazy occasion in most cities, and in my hometown of Dublin, it is no exception. Last week, I found myself with a few days off on either side of our national holiday, and so decided to get away from the madness of the city and spend some time camping and hiking in the nearby mountains. On the eve of my trip, my buddy calls me to tell me that he is sick and would not be joining me on the adventure. Who needs him, I thought, and I decided to make the trip alone. The weather was beautiful, and I spent a very enjoyable St. Patrick's Day, hiking through the woods and mountains above Dublin, alongside a good number of smaller-minded folk. At roughly 4 p.m, I spotted a nice thicket of trees in the distance, and made my way towards them, to what looked like a perfect campsite. I found a clearing, set up a shelter, and prepared a delicious dinner before settling down with a book and the sounds of the wilderness for company. But at 7 p.m, something changed. I suddenly became very uncomfortable and agitated. There was someone nearby. Somehow I just knew it. It was completely dark, and I scanned the surrounding woods with my torch but could see nothing out of the ordinary. It was just me and the trees. Settle down, I told myself. It's natural to feel a bit scared when you're alone in the woods, but no matter how much I tried to clear my mind, I couldn't shake the gut feeling that the situation just wasn't right. I knew that the last bus left the nearest village at 10:30 p.m, and it would take roughly 3 hours by foot to get there. In the heat of the moment, I decided to get the hell out of there and take my chances on the trail. I packed my gear in record time and moved out, stumbling over fallen trees and thick foliage until I hit the trail. I was in a panic, but comforted by the well-trodden path. A half hour of gentle descent and I'd be on the paved road, and after that, it was only an hour of well-frequented national road that led to the village. Only after a few hundred meters was I stopped in my tracks. Sitting on a tree stump just off the side of the trail sat a lone figure. By the light of my headlamp, I saw that it was a man dressed in dark street clothes, rather than the bright hiking gear one might expect. I was instantly on edge. There was no point in trying to hide, as he had no doubt already seen me with my headlamp and reflective jacket. We drew closer in the darkness, and I saw that this man was roughly in his 30s. As I passed, he looked at me, smiled and said,
"Lovely evening."
"Yeah, it is." I continued forward on my guard. After a minute or two, I turned to look behind me and saw no sign of the man. There was a house a kilometre or so in the distance, and I thought the best thing to do would be stop there for directions to the village road. Several minutes later, I felt a pang of uneasiness and checked the path behind me, only to see the figure once again, this time on foot, heading in the same direction as me. I hurried towards the house. I felt much more relaxed once I reached the warm glow of the cottage. I got the direction from a very nice elderly couple and was pleased to learn the road was just a small distance away at the bottom of their driveway. With no sign of the man behind me, I walked on. Just as I reached the road, I heard a banging noise from the direction of the houses, followed by an out-of-breath familiar voice.
"I've been separated from my friend. Did he come this way?"
Without thinking, I scrambled up the embankment at the side of the road and concealed myself as best I could, one hand on my camping knife. My heart has never beat so fast. I couldn't hear the householder's reply, just the sound of the door closing after by on the footsteps of the gravel driveway. I saw the man silhouetted by the moonlight walk into a road and peer into the distance in either direction, before hurrying off in the opposite direction of the village. I waited in the hedgerow for about 15 to 20 minutes, completely terrified, before plucking up the courage to continue my walk to civilization. I trudged on for over an hour, before I heard the rumble of a car engine in the distance and saw its headlights approach. I stuck out my thumb, and to my surprise the driver stopped. I asked if he could give me a ride to the village and he said no problem. Once in the car, the driver, a friendly Polish man, asked if I was looking for my friend. Friend? No. I was out hiking alone and I just lost track of time. I lied, not wanting to admit that I got scared camping alone. Oh. I only asked because I was just flagged down by another younger man who told me he was looking for his friend and you fit his description perfectly. He seemed very agitated. In shock, I told the driver about my encounter with the mountain man and how he had headed in the opposite direction over an hour ago. Well, he must have turned around because he stopped me only a few hundred meters before the stop where I picked you up. 5 minutes later, I was back in the well-lit, very populated village. I made it in time for the bus, and within the hour was back in the Dublin city centre. I have no idea what was going on with that man, or what he intended to do if he caught up to me. I'm just glad that I followed my gut, and was lucky enough to make it home, with nothing more than an odd story. And a big thank you to Darius for the lift.
This took place several years ago, when I was 18 and freshly enrolled into college. I am an Asian female and grew up in an extremely strict household. My parents set my curfew at 8 p.m, and I wasn't allowed to drive at night or go to parties, all because my family was convinced that all of these situations led to rape. Anyway, you could see how, once I moved out of the house, I relished any opportunity to exercise my new freedom and independence. One night, at around 11 p.m, I got super hungry and had a real craving for an Arby's roast beef sandwich. My roommate was tired and didn't want to go with me, so I hopped in my car and decided to make a quick trip by myself. To get to Arby's, I had to take a stretch of road that was really secluded and not well lit. Of course, at that time of night, there were barely any cars on the road. At a stoplight, just a few blocks from the Arby's, I was the third car waiting at the red light. Car A was in the very front. Car B was behind it, and I was behind Car B. There was a last car, Car C, that was behind me. All of a sudden, I guess he must have thought the light turned, but it was still red. The car in front of me stepped on the gas and lurched forward, tapping the back of the car in front of him. The two drivers immediately got out and started looking at the damage. Neither of them were hurt, and there was little to no damage that I could see made to either car. I had no idea what to do in that situation. Again, I was a dumb 18-year-old, just ejected into the adult world, and I had never witnessed an accident of any kind before. Was I supposed to stick around as a witness or something? I wasn't sure, but I felt very uneasy about the idea of getting out of my car in the middle of the night on a really isolated road to talk to these two guys, especially when I don't think they needed my intervention at all. Again, it was a super minor fender bender, and they were talking about it civilly, though they didn't move their cars. So when the light turned green, I decided to just move over into the other lane and proceed on my way. Again, this may have been the wrong thing to do, but I didn't know any better. The car that had been behind me did not like that I was trying to leave. To this day, I have no idea what they were thinking. At the time, I thought that they must have thought I caused the accident, or something. Anyway, as I shifted over to the other lane to leave, they started blasting their horn at me. I got super scared and proceeded down the road, past the green light, and the car. Car C, the one behind me, took off after me. What ensued was still the most terrifying experience I've ever had. The car, which I could dimly see had 2 male figures in the front seat, followed me closely for quite a while, occasionally blasting their horn aggressively. They would speed up until they were just about to hit the back of my car. I was starting to get really freaked out, so I started making random turns to lose them, or to see if they really were following me. They definitely were. I made 3 left turns, and they were still on my tail. Eventually, the car pulled over into the lane beside me, and kept speeding up and nudging into my lane, as if to cut me off or run me off the road. I was actually crying now, and had called my then boyfriend, telling him what was happening. I initially wanted to drive to his house, but then I realized I didn't want these psychos knowing where he lived. I tried to avoid making eye contact with the 2 men in the car beside me, and tried not to let them intimidate me off the road. They kept blaring the horn, and then eventually, the driver rolled down the window. I was too scared to talk to him, but I could hear what he screamed clearly through my window, which had a slight gap in the top that never sealed up. "We're gonna catch you, bitch. I'm going to rape your dumb ass." I think the guy next to him said something like, "Don't slow down," or something, but I couldn't hear it as clearly over the rushing of the wind and the sounds of our cars accelerating. My boyfriend heard them shouting from over the phone and directed me to the nearest police station, which was about 8 minutes away from where I was. The 2 guys kept shouting things at me, but I don't know what else was said, because I was too busy blubbering to my boyfriend. I was speeding so fast to try to get away from these guys at this point, that I was hoping a cop would stop me. There were no cars on any of the roads we went down, and it just made everything worse and worse. And then, my phone battery decided it was time to die. I seriously thought I was in one of the horror stories my parents had always told me about. Eventually, I finally saw the police station my boyfriend had given me the directions to, and turned into the parking lot. The car followed me, and the passenger door actually opened before the car even stopped. But then I think they noticed where they were, and they drove out of there. Fast. I sat in my car, too terrified to get out, because I thought moving would provoke them into coming back. Literally, 60 seconds later, my boyfriend pulled into the parking lot next to my car and climbed out with a baseball bat. He held me for a little while, and then a cop who was pulling into the lot approached us and asked if everything was okay. It turns out that the car that tailed me fit the description of a car that had apparently scared a girl so badly that she had crashed her car into a tree, trying to get away from these guys. Neither she or I got a license plate though, and to this day, I don't know if they ever caught those guys. I don't know what kind of human being gets their kicks out of terrorizing female drivers, but whoever they were, fuck those guys. I hope someone, somewhere, managed to put a stop to them.
So I recently started school again, and as part of my daily routine, I'm required to travel to Toronto Monday to Friday via train and subway lines. It's about a good 2 hours one way. So I usually pull out a good book, pop in my headphones, and relax to some light music. I, of course, being from out of town, have heard a lot of the horror stories that many people have experienced on public transportation. Naturally, I thought most of it was just over-exaggeration and tall tales. However, I was very quickly proven dead wrong. Rewind to about a week ago. I had just finished a very long, grueling day of school, 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., and I wanted nothing more than to just relax and get home as soon as possible. I took my usual bus route to the subway station and sat down on one of the seats directly next to an exit door. Now, a little context. I am facing forward, looking at the one seat ahead of me across the aisle of the subway car. This seat was occupied by a 20-something Asian lady who was playing some game on her phone and was paying absolutely no attention to anything going on around her. Next to the seat opposite me is another seat facing the Asian lady, and it's this person in this seat that made my 40-minute subway ride very disturbing. Occupying the seat was a lady about 30 to 40 years of age who possessed a very creepy smile. I say this because she never stopped smiling, and I mean she was smiling the entire subway ride. Anyways, the car pulled out of the station and we were on our way. For the first half of my trip, she would continuously be staring at this Asian girl, laughing and muttering to herself. She would also take her phone out of her purse and started taking pictures of this girl. How the Asian lady did not see this, I still have no clue. About halfway up the tracks, the Asian lady left the car, and this is where the attention was directed to me. She turned towards me and just smiled at me with a huge toothy grin. I knew deep down that if I made eye contact, I was going to be in for a bad time. So I just stared at a poster on the roof of the train for what felt like hours. Eventually, she got the hint that I was avoiding her gaze like the plague and went to plan B. She opened her purse and removed a tube of toothpaste. Colgate was written on the side, and proceeded to ingest roughly half of the tube. I damn near threw up then and there. Somehow, I held it together. My stop came, and I bolted from that car as fast as I could. I got to the escalator and glanced back, and guess who I see fast walking after me, arms at her side, still smiling. I was understandably shitting my pants, terrified by this point. I ran out of that station right to the bus, just as it was pulling out of the station. I took one final look, and there she was, standing on the platform, head cocked to the side, laughing and waving goodbye. So that's the story of how I lost 5 pounds of sweat and ran faster than Usain Bolt.
About 10 years ago, I studied abroad. I had few friends in this new country and was glad to find a place to live with some cool people my own age. I started hanging with this crew, which became my friends, and we used to smoke a lot of weed. Things were sweet. There was this one friend of my roommates, Frank, that came over to our place from time to time. I thought it was odd because he was like twice everybody's age. He was very intense as a person and made me feel slightly uncomfortable. The first time I met him, he seemed extremely suspicious of me and would ask me all kinds of questions to suss me out. but he had a good sense of humor and would always crack great jokes. In a way, he was kind of charming, and my roommates seemed to love him. Also, he always brought pizza. I asked one of my friends what the deal was with this guy, and he was like, "Oh, you don't know? Last year he found his girlfriend and her siblings murdered in their flat. He's under investigation, but he didn't do it." I was taken aback by this. How could they really know he didn't do it? And why did they want to hang around with a potential psycho? I gave it the benefit of the doubt, but I certainly saw Frank in a new light now. Time went on, and Frank came by our place almost daily. He was very clever and sly, manipulative. I got to know more about his background. He used to be in a gang when he was my age. He had been in prison for most of the time in between then and now for violence. This didn't help me in trusting him. I couldn't believe how naive my roommates were to trust this man. Then police went out and declared him a suspect. By now, this had become the biggest investigation ever in that particular area. He was interrogated, but released for lack of evidence. Back home at our place, he would sit and talk about how he was a victim of a conspiracy, and all of my friends would nod and believe him. I felt crazy for being the only one who didn't believe it. He must have sensed it, because he took me outside and asked me if I believed him one time. I said, yeah, sure I did, because by now I was starting to get really afraid of him. I asked him about the murders, where he told me his version of the events, where, according to him, he found the bodies. It was gruesome, but I still had doubts, and to my horror, he would at another time crack jokes about the whole thing. Who in their right mind would joke about that? In my mind, only a complete psychopath. I started researching what a psychopath actually is, and learned that this guy fit every classical definition. I freaked out, because I couldn't figure out what he really wanted from us. I started getting paranoid, and started believing that he actually planned on killing me and my roommates. I couldn't tell this to my roommates, because they were fully blinded by this guy's charades and trusted him. At one point I started sleeping with a knife in my bed. That's how scared I was that he was going to come and murder us like he murdered those poor souls. This was a horrible time for me. On top of that, police had been tipped off about the relatively large amounts of weed being kept in the house and started raiding the place. 2 of my roommates were busted, and this marked the breakup of our collective. The day I moved out, Frank helped me with my stuff and looked at me, menacingly as I always found him. "You're all right," he said. "I actually planned on killing you, but you're all right." I kid you not. He told me this. The others would laugh it off as a joke, but I saw it very differently. I was glad to leave after hanging out with this murderer on and off for 1.5 years. Frank would be arrested shortly later, starting a huge trial that lasted several years. I found some new friends and got back to some normality in my life. That's when I realized how fucked up the whole situation was. I had been isolated with all of this and had no one else to go to. A year later, I was back in my home country and followed the trial. All the craziness that surfaced about this man during the trial would convince me that I was probably right all along. He was proper mental and was convicted of 4 life sentences. He will never be a free man again.
This happened when I was about 12 years old. My friends and I used to ride our bikes all over Hell's Half Acre. We lived in a neighborhood bordering East Cleveland that got a lot of spill over crime from the ghetto. Most of these criminals were high school kids in gangs committing senseless crimes. There were lots of murders, robberies, and I even had one friend whose mother was in the wrong place at the wrong time and was killed by a stray bullet from a drive-by shooting. I guess our town wasn't the best neighborhood, but it wasn't the worst either. So I had saved up my money from birthdays and holidays. I saved up enough to buy a new mountain bike. It was pretty badass, although I believe it was only like $200, but it was the first thing I have ever saved my money for and bought for myself. Naturally, I wanted to take it in the woods to rip some trails, but being in an urban environment, all we had nearby were some small patches of woods. A few years prior to this, I ran away from home. I got lost for like 4 hours before stopping at a gas station and calling my dad to come pick me up. The reason I got lost is because I went behind the local post office and went through a pretty big wooded lot, the biggest I had seen in the area, and when I came out, I didn't recognize anything. So anyways, I called up my friend who also had a mountain bike and told him about the wood lot. We decided to go rip the trails. When we arrived at the post office, the scene was pretty much the same, except they fenced off the area with probably an 8-foot fence and barbed wire. Not the looping razor wire that is impossible to climb that you see in prisons and military compounds. Just regular barbed wire. Luckily, there was a small cut in the fence that we could sneak through with the bikes without having to climb over the barbed wire. Our urban exploration had brought us over many barbed wire fences, so we were accustomed to getting over them, but never with our bikes. So we snuck into the wood lot, got on our bikes and headed down the trail, which was on a downhill decline. As we just started to pick up speed, we were not even 50 yards into the lot when we saw ahead of us, probably another 50 feet, a group of 8 to 10 older black kids. They were all tatted up and not dressed like they were there for a camping trip. They were just standing there around a fire, smoking cigarettes or weed. We stopped and looked at them for what seemed like only a few seconds, and they seemed to notice us immediately. At first, they started yelling at us to come over to them. Neither of us moved. We were both good kids with good families, and we knew this was not a situation that we wanted to be in. They began getting more aggressive when we didn't respond, screaming, "I said get the fuck over here." At this point, my friend and I looked at one another, knowing they wanted to steal our bikes and probably beat us up. We both were hoping one of us had some kind of an escape plan. And when we looked back to see what they were doing, we saw 2 of them running at us. We flipped our bikes around and took off back towards the fence. We were pedaling uphill, so we were going slower than we would have if we were on foot. I was in front and I jumped off my bike and ran with my bike in tow beside me. My friend followed and did the same. We were covering ground faster on foot since we were going uphill and couldn't gain any momentum on the bikes. We get to the top of the hill and were greeted by the barbed wire fence. We wasted no time looking for the opening because it was well hidden and a pain in the ass to get through. So I just grabbed my bike and threw it over the fence. Then I grabbed my friend's bike and did the same. We scaled the barbed wire and jumped down from the top and into the parking lot where our bikes lay astrew, and hurriedly picked them up. Scaling the barbed wire had bought us some time. because the two guys behind us were holding the fence open for each other and one guy got his shirt snagged. We took off as fast as we could, and now we were on smooth pavement and a flat landscape. There's no way we were getting caught by someone on foot. We sped off a mile or so down the road and stopped at the gas station, scared shitless and gasping for air. We looked back and saw nobody. We had escaped, or so we thought. As we sat there in the parking lot of the gas station recapping what had just taken place, we were getting ready to ride away when our worst nightmare unfolded. An old body-style Grand Marquis pulled up, and in it were the guys from the woods. My relief of having escaped faded as the car pulled in and one of the guys jumped out. We jumped on our bikes and sped off before they could do anything, pedaling as fast as we could. They got in the car and followed us through the neighborhood as we were cutting through backyards and running for our lives. We eventually found our way into the backyard of someone's house, a couple of blocks down from my house that lived on a corner, and had a large wooden private fence which we hid behind. We could still see through the small cracks between the wooden planks and had a view of the street from two different angles. We saw the car pass twice, then nothing, but we didn't want to risk coming out yet. What if they were waiting up the street? What if they were waiting down the street? We didn't know what to do. Then the luckiest thing happened. The guy whose yard we were hiding in called the police. We saw the flashing lights through the fence and panicked. We thought we were going to be arrested, but the cops weren't concerned with what we were doing as much as they were concerned about who we were hiding from. We told them the story, and they gave us a ride back to our houses. It was over. The cops never did find who those guys were or what they wanted. I could only imagine that they wanted our bikes or they just wanted to beat us up for fun. Or maybe both. I moved out of that area about 3 years later, and my friend I was with stayed. He's currently serving jail time for gang-related crimes. 14 years later, as a 26-year-old, 6-foot, 225-pound guy, I still have frequent nightmares, at least once a month, where I am on foot or on a bike running through my old neighborhood while being chased by gangsters who want to kill me. This was probably the most terrifying experience of my life.
This happened to a friend of mine last summer. About 20 students, including myself from my university, did a study abroad program in France last summer. We were spending a week in Paris before going to the towns where the university was located. Most of the group got a group flight deal to Paris through the university, and a few others flew separately. The only requirement was that we had to be in Paris by the day we had to leave to go to our university. Most of us had arrived by the third day into our Paris trip, with the exception of my friend Amanda. Naturally, we were all worried about her because her phone was not working properly. She had to update us through Facebook whenever she could get free Wi-Fi, which wasn't very often, and her flight had been delayed about 6 times already. Another day passed, and still, nothing from Amanda. We were all freaking out at this point, since her phone wasn't working. We had absolutely no way of contacting her. The 5th day rolls around, and still nothing. We all had a scheduled bike tour of the city that morning, and a boat ride on the river that afternoon. So we didn't return to the hotel about 7 o'clock that evening. Amanda was asleep in our room, as we were assigned roommates. Of course, I woke her up and asked her where the hell she'd been. She told me, when she finally got to the airport, She was exhausted and broke. She had multiple layovers and had basically spent all her cash on food. Plus, her bank card wasn't working abroad. For those of you unfamiliar with the Charles de Gaulle airport, it's absolutely massive. Unless you have a map or understand French completely, you will get lost. So, she gets there, lost, broke, tired and hungry, and carrying 3 big-ass bags sitting inside the terminal. She said that this good-looking guy then walked up to her and began talking to her in perfect English. "You look tired. Do you need a taxi ride to your hotel?" Red flag number 1. What taxi driver gets out of his cab and walks into the airport to find a rider? Not thinking, Amanda says, "Yeah, thank you so much. I'm exhausted." He smiles at her and grabs one of her heavier bags and tells her to follow him. She does, and he leads her to this elevator. Red flag number 2. She was already on street level from where the taxis departed. She then gets inside, and he hits the button for the basement level. He gets on the phone before the elevator opens and starts speaking in French, which she could not really understand because it was slang. She starts freaking out as the doors open. It was a service deck meant for employees of the airport or something, not for passenger parking or taxi pickup. It was damp and dark, she said, something quite literally out of a horror movie. The guy gets out of the elevator first and turns to her smiling. "Allons-y," which means let's go. She takes a few steps and sees, in the far corner of the deck, the truck of this green, unmarked van with no apparent license plate, and a huge, ugly-ass Middle Eastern guy steps out of the driver's seat. It's at this point that she realizes that she's in trouble, and she doesn't want to alert the smiling guy that she's about to get the hell out of there. There's no one in sight, so screaming would be useless, but the lift door is still open. She quickly puts down one of her bags in the middle of the lift entrance to hold the lift, and told the smiley guy that she needed her wallet and that it was in the bag he was carrying. He looks at her sternly for about a minute, but walks over to her and hands her the bag. She told me. She pushed him down to the ground with the weight of the bag and got back in the elevator as fast as she could. He got up and was bounding after her. She said, "Girl, I hit every goddamn button on that elevator panel." The doors closed, and as soon as he reached her, she could hear him banging as she was going back up to street level. She got to the taxi pickup lane and began bawling. A police officer approached her and she told him what had happened. He was kind enough to drive her to the hotel. On the way to the hotel, he informed her that the men were likely linked to a sex trafficking ring that were approaching young women inside the airport who had tags on their luggage indicating that they had come from the USA, as they assumed that American women were more trusting.
I was a sophomore at Boston University at the time this happened, so the year was either 2012 or 2013. I was living on campus on a small street named Bay State Road. The majority of Boston University's campus is an approximate 1-mile stretch along the bustling Commonwealth Avenue, and behind the buildings on Com Avenue is the parallel Bay State Road, a brownstone and cherry blossom-lined street that provides dorms for BU students, as well as some MIT fraternity houses. It's beautiful, and in an area of Boston that's pretty busy, it feels quiet and safe. It didn't feel so safe this particular Saturday. I was walking down Bay State Road towards Kenmore Square between noon and 2 p.m. when I noticed it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a white van heading up the street, veer from the right side of the road to the left side, close to where I was on the sidewalk. Since I was walking past a larger dorm building, I thought the van was parking near the sidewalk to make some sort of delivery for the school. I didn't give it much attention. "Hey kid." I turned around. I thought the driver was looking for help and where he should park to make his delivery, so I went a little closer. "You, want a free stereo? You'll have to climb inside and get it." It's amazing how time seems to slow down when you're entering fight or flight. This line felt so ridiculous and cheesy, I thought this had to be a badly written script from a film major's project, and someone nearby was filming my reaction. Or at least, one of the fraternities on the road was playing an insensitive prank. My eyes darted around. There were no windows in the back of the van, so I wasn't being filmed from the inside. No one with cameras on the sidewalk, nor the sidewalk across the street, and there weren't many hiding spots nearby for a hidden shot. This was real. I looked back to the driver to find his own eyes locked on me. I can tell he never looked away while I was making my assessment, just staring at me with this strange look of amusement, like we were in the middle of a game of chess and he was only a couple of moves away from checkmate. What's worse, this tall, fairly muscular man in his 50s had his right hand on the steering wheel and his left below the window, assumedly on the door handle. He was in position to bust open the door and make a move towards me at any second. And with him ready to pounce, I thought there was no way I could outrun him to the building entrance, yards behind me. I tried to distract him with questions about the supposed stereo while I shifted my position to get a better idea if I could make a run for security. I thought a sprint could be possible until I finally noticed his friend in the passenger seat. A second man was sitting on the passenger side, obscured by the larger and older man. This man was younger, in his 30s, and was also fit. He was also just as creepy as his friend. He leaned forward to get a better look at me, and smiled. This smile, if every alarm wasn't already ringing inside my body, they certainly were now. The both of them gave me the same sleazy, chilling smile. Now, I'm a very intuitive person, and the vibe I was getting from these two men wasn't serial killer. It was something stranger and more gross, and the only thing that feels close to correctly describing it was sexual. As in, if these two men did manage to burst out of the front of the van and wrangle me inside the back of the van, something other than mutilation or murder was going to happen to my body. And I distinctly remember the feeling that they didn't just want to take me somewhere else. No, there was something in the back of that van. At this point, I felt like I was out of options, so if these two were going to pounce on me, I might as well give them a struggle they weren't expecting. I gave them my best fuck off face, made myself look bigger, and put every drop of venom I had behind my response when they asked me again if I wanted to get inside. No. And I stared them down. Just stood there and returned the uncomfortable stare they've been giving me. And for some reason, it worked. Their smiles were replaced by looks of disappointment and a general sense of, it's not worth it. They leaned back into their seats, put the van in drive, and punched the gas, heading back towards Com Avenue. As the van drove off, I tried to get a look at the license plate to report it to the BU police, but I couldn't get a good read of it because of my nearsightedness, and reporting a generic white van driven by two generic-looking white men somewhere in uptown Boston felt fruitless. It was bizarre. Two men tried to lure a younger man into their van in the middle of the day on a populated street. It sounds so stupid to me. I still question if it was real or fake.
So this story happened back when I was in 5th grade in 2005, when I lived in western Montana. My bedroom was shared with my 2nd grade sister, and we had a king-size bed that we both slept on. To describe our house a bit, our room was facing the backyard, but was a basement room. Basically standing up looking out the window in my room, I was eye level with the ground outside. Up and to the left above my window, I could see onto our deck, which looked into our upstairs kitchen. Kind of confusing, but bear with me. Anyways, this particular night, my sister and I were having a sleepover, and our friend was in the bed with us. When we were falling asleep around 1 a.m., our friend woke us up to show us that a deer was on our deck. We looked out, and we all saw a deer on the deck. This was normal in Montana, so we laid back down. I guess my friend stayed up and stared at it. She woke us up 5 minutes later, saying that she actually thought it was a person. Right then we all looked at it, and we saw the shadow move a little. It was clearly a tall person's silhouette. We all started freaking out, and then we saw 2 green laser lights. They were just 2 small pinpoint lights that were coming from the guy's head area. We all thought it was binoculars. At this point we were on high alert, and our eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and we saw it was clearly a guy looking into our kitchen window. I was too scared to go tell my parents all the way upstairs and past the view of the guy looking in the window. So we used my friend's cell phone and called the house phone. Neither me or my sister owned cell phones at the time. The phone rang loudly, and we watched the guy run full speed off the deck. As soon as he ran away, the 3 of us ran screaming upstairs and told my dad. He called the cops and they searched the streets, but they never found the guy. Now here's where things get weird. So just 2 weeks earlier, the town's police station sent around notices in our neighborhood telling us that a person of interest and dangerous sexual predator who had a warrant out for his arrest had been spotted in our area. A tip had said he was staying with a family member 3 streets down from us. I remember this because I remember my mom, who was a bit paranoid, drove us by the address of the house and made us very aware of what was going on, and would not let us ride our bikes outside during this time. I remember looking at the house every time we drove by it. Turns out, 2 or 3 months later, this same man was apprehended for the kidnappings, abuse, and murders of 2 children and killing their families in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, only 2 hours away from my house. In some of his interrogations, he confessed to stalking the kids by watching their homes at night with night vision goggles. I also found some obscure website that had some of his writings where he discussed living in Montana and talked about how right before killing this family, he was searching for children to kidnap. We were around the same ages as the kids who were taken by him. I have no proof that he was the person looking into our window that night, but the evidence all adds up for me, down to the timeline and the area I lived at the time. I don't want to go into too much detail of his crimes. They were all over the news, and you can read about them in various articles online. I researched this guy in depth, and he was a sick motherfucker. He allegedly has encrypted diaries of his crimes and filmed the tortures he committed, so I consider myself blessed. Hopefully he stays locked up, so I never have to meet him.